heard of a guy named Robert Parker? Is that name familiar? Robert Parker published The Wine Advocate for many years, and he was known as the world's most powerful critic for a long time. He was the guy that did the, this wine is a 91, this wine is a 92. He started that. And when people asked him, Robert, why is this one a 92? He would kind of say, because it's one better than a 91. Which was unsatisfying to some people, but he was an incredibly important, influential critic, and he would move the world wine industry with his palate. He had this incredibly sharp palate, and if you know anything about wine, one of the hardest things to do is to judge the quality of brand new Bordeaux wine and to make a prediction about how good that wine is going to be when it's ready to drink 15 or 20 years hence. Great Bordeaux wine takes a long time to mature, but you have to know what you should pay for it at harvest time. It's a very difficult task of prediction, and Parker and his wine snob colleagues would say the way to do that is to get people with very good palates like us, and we will taste the wine, which is essentially undrinkable when it's first put into casks in Bordeaux, and we're going to tell you how good this wine is going to be. That's the kind of thing that you really need a human expert for. And there was another guy who took a very different approach, and there's an economist at Princeton named Orley Ashenfelter, which is one of my favorite geek names of all time. It's just a great name for a guy who plays with numbers all day. And I'm gonna use the phrase geek a lot this morning. I mean it as a term of unambiguous praise, and we'll see why. Ashenfelter was a classic geek, and he took a look at this whole enterprise of tasting wine and assessing wine, and in particular the great Bordeaux wines, and he basically said, nonsense. The way you all are going about it is ridiculous. The truth is to be found in the numbers. And in particular, he had this ridiculous idea that wine is an agricultural product, and the quality of agricultural products is determined by things like weather. So his approach was, I'm going to grab a bunch of data about weather over the years in Bordeaux. I'm going to use my statistical toolkit. I'm going to compare it to how good the wines eventually were, and I'm going to build a model that will predict the quality of Bordeaux wine based on a few things. This was the equation that he came up with for the quality of Bordeaux wine. Got it? It's 12.145 plus 3 other things. All you actually need to know to assess the quality of great Bordeaux wines is 3 things. How much winter rainfall there was, what the average growing season temperature was, and then a penalty if there was rain during the harvest season. And he said this is going to be an accurate prediction about the eventual quality and hence the auction price of great Bordeaux wines. Can you imagine what Parker and his colleagues thought of this when it came out? So when he first published these results, the wine world rose up as one to mock him with all the tools at their disposal. Parker, in addition to having a sharp palate, had a very sharp tongue, and he had some wonderful quotes. He said, this is basically like reviewing a movie without having seen it. Just looking at data about the stars and the director and making an assessment of the quality of the movie that way. Parker was scathing about what a ridiculous approach this was, except it turns out that it actually works. Ashenfelter started this in the late 80s, and he was one of the first guys to say that the 1989 Bordeaux vintage is going to be one of the great wines of the century. This is a really bold prediction. He also said the 90 vintage was going to be spectacular. It turns out those are exactly right. And he has turned the wine world on its ear. And in particular, when people are looking to figure out how much they should be willing to spend for the great Bordeaux wines at harvest now, this geek approach rules the day. And the old approach of let's taste this nasty substance and try to use our palates to figure out what's going on has really faded into obscurity simply because the numbers have turned out to be more accurate. We already learned there are a few wine drinkers in here. Are there any political junkies in the room? He asked at the Aspen Ideas Festival. So I wasn't here earlier this week. Did any of us get a chance to listen to Nate Silver? One of the geek heroes of the modern era. Nate plays with numbers and tries to make predictions in many different areas, baseball first and more recently politics. He did a pretty good job of predicting what was going to happen in the 2008 presidential election. So the New York Times gave him a platform, a blogging platform for the 2012 presidential election, and he ran a blog called 538 about the number of total electoral votes in the country. And throughout the election season, he would draw graphs like this. which were the two lines represent his estimates for how likely it is that Obama in blue versus Romney in red is going to win the election. So those two numbers will always add up to 100 because there was no real third-party candidate. And Silver would draw lines like this. And you notice that the blue is always on top. They never cross, and they never actually get that close to each other. So what Silver was saying was this election is actually not close. And the data that he was relying on were publicly available data. And he said, look, I'm not talking behind the scenes to the campaigns. I'm not putting my own boots on the ground in the swing states. All I'm doing is crunching the data from the state and national level polls. I correct for the biases. This is what my geek toolkit is good for. And based on that, this is my read about how the election is going to go. So his prediction was very consistent. This election is not going to be close. It's going to be close in terms of the popular vote. But from what we can tell, Obama has a big enough lead in the swing states to carry the Electoral College without much margin, without much to worry about. And this election is actually not very close. Again, can you imagine what the political pundit class thought of this approach to forecasting political elections? Let me give you a couple of quotes. David Brooks, who's actually here at the Ideas Festival this week, wrote a couple of columns about this approach and was fairly scathing about it. He said, one thing we know is that experts with fancy computer models are terrible at predicting human behavior. This is a fairly ridiculous approach to the problem. Morning Joe on his show was even more scathing. He said, this guy is a joke. If he thinks the election is close, he's kidding himself. If it's anything but a toss-up, you should be kept away from computers, laptops, and microphones. He said this about 10 days for the election because you're an active joke here. And then if that's not enough, this is Michael Barron, who by a lot of accounts is one of the deans of the American political scene. And he did my favorite expert rundown of what was going to happen in the election. This is a column he published a couple days before the election, where he relied on his accumulated expertise and intuition and gut about what was happening state by state. And so he tallied up all the states, especially the swing states, and he said, this is how I see it. Romney 315, Obama 223. This election is all about fundamentals. Geeks with their spreadsheets don't understand fundamentals. Experts who have decades of experience are the guys that understand this stuff. So listen to this. We all know what happened here, right? In 2008, I think Silver called something between 48 and 49 of the states correctly. In 2012, he called all 50 states correctly. There was some worry before the election that he had overstepped himself. He'd finally gone too far, and he was going to be a one-term celebrity. Instead, he's now anointed the king of the quants. That's why I call him a geek hero. He got all 50 states right, got the electoral vote total exactly right. We don't want to give him too much credit. There were a couple other geeks running blogs and keeping a running tally of the election. They were completely consistent with each other because they were relying on the same body of data, all this polling data, and they were using kind of the same statistical toolkit. So they were very consistent throughout. Nate was actually the most circumspect out of all of them. There were other people saying this election is a runaway. There is a 100% chance that Obama is going to win it. And most of the geeks got the electoral vote breakdown exactly right. They got 332 for Obama, which is exactly how it wound up. So I start to see enough examples of this, and it feels to me like there's kind of a head-to-head war going on, or a battle between two approaches. One is this, to making things that we care a lot about, to making diagnoses or decisions or predictions in areas that we care a lot about. Who's going to win the election? What disease does this patient have? How much should I pay for this bottle of wine? Should we hire this person? Should we let this prisoner out on parole or not? These are consequential decisions in a lot of areas, and we have two broad approaches to making them. One is this geek-based approach, where they don't rely on any specific expertise in the area. They just rely on the fact that they've got a decent body of data to work with, and they have chops about how to work with that data. They've got statistical training. They know how to extract, as Nate would say, the signal from the noise in the data. That's what their training is. They are explicitly not experts in the domain itself. We contrast that with HIPPOs. Has anyone heard this acronym before? This is my new favorite business acronym because it describes how most organizations actually make their decisions and their predictions. A HIPPO is a style of decision making. It stands for the highest paid person's opinion. So you rely on these experts. You rely on the people at the top of the org chart, the expensive consultants you bring in, the outside experts who understand the domain very well. And by virtue of their intelligence, their expertise, their training, the gut feel they've built up in this domain over sometimes a long and very successful career, they are the hippos. They're the ones that should be making the decisions here. So this contrast is a really stark contrast. It's a contrast between people who explicitly know nothing about the domain and just like playing with numbers, versus people who think that numbers are for pencil-necked geeks, and the way you make a good decision is to have a lot of expertise built up in that domain itself. The conclusion from a lot of research is amazingly clear. The geeks win. The hippos lose out over and over, even in domains where I wouldn't have expected it to happen. So Phil Tetlock is a guy who's been looking at political forecasting for a long time. Is the Soviet Union going to collapse? Is the GDP going to rise or fall? What's going to happen in the Middle East? You can go to a lot of sessions here at the Ideas Festival every year and listen to really experienced people who have spent a lot of time giving us their prediction about how events are going to unfold in different parts of the world. Tetlock, for a bunch of years, has been running a great ongoing set of experiments where he tries to pin these experts down about their predictions and then see how well they actually hold up given real events. And his conclusions are kind of shocking to me. He said anything beyond a year, anything, even medium term, short term, let alone the long term. Anything beyond about a year, it's very hard for these political analysts, people who do this for a living, to do better than chance, to be better than a coin flip about the predictions that they make. And they tend to be ridiculously overconfident. So if you ask them to say, give us some things that you are 90% sure are going to happen in the world of the political economy, typically about 60 or 70% of those things actually happen. We're highly overconfident about our judgments here. When you look at some leading geek-driven companies and what they've learned, this is the head of human resources at Google. He was interviewed a little while back in the Times. And after crunching a lot of data about success and failure in careers at Google, they came to a bunch of fairly weird conclusions. They say, for example, that the interview, as we're currently doing it for a lot of companies, should we hire this person or not, the interview contains absolutely no information. And your success in an interview is unrelated to how well you actually do at the company. So you see enough examples like that. It's a complete random mess, he said, the way we're currently doing talent evaluation and recruiting and hiring. Until Google changed its approach, their results were a complete random mess here. So you see enough examples like this and you start to wonder, is this evidence of a broad phenomenon? Or, for example, am I just cherry picking the data because I like geeks and I'm trying to sway you in one way or another? Luckily, there's been research on this topic. This is just a mind-blowing study that was done. It turns out that over the years, there have been about 136 studies done where they took a human expert in a field, very often medical or clinical, and they compared that to a data-driven approach to the results of an algorithm. What does this person have? What is their diagnosis? Will they get better or not? Will this student do well in school? So they did 136. They were able to find 136 studies where there is a head-to-head comparison between a hippo, between a human expert, and a purely algorithmic, a purely data-driven prediction. And the scorecard breaks down into three main areas. So these researchers divided into three main buckets. One is areas where the expert was clearly better. One was a toss-up. There's no significant difference between the human prediction and the algorithmic prediction. And then where the data was clearly better, where this complete geek-based approach, this data-driven approach, was significantly better than what the human came up with. Are we all interested in the breakdown? The biggest category was toss-up, no difference whatsoever. In just about half the cases, 48% of the cases, there was no difference in predictive ability between the expert and the complete output from an algorithm. The bad news is that in 46% of the cases, the data alone did a significantly better job. In other words, you would have been better off ignoring the expert completely, putting cotton in your ears, and just looking at what the data told you. That leaves about 6% of the cases where the experts were significantly better than the data. The human batting average here is about 0.059. That's not major league at all. That's really not doing very well. So as we've taken the most thorough looks possible at this topic, the human experts, and in these studies, they really were relying on experts, trained doctors, physicians, clinicians, mental health experts. So these were the hippos in their field. And when you stack them up against the data, their batting average is about 0.059. So this is I continue to find this a deeply weird phenomenon. But one that we really need to take into account if we want to make better decisions and better predictions, and I think we clearly do. It kind of brings up a fairly deep question. What on earth is going on? Why are our experts so bad when we stack them up against cold, hard, raw, stripped down data? What explains this weird result here? I think there are two main things going on. The first one is that, and I should back up a second, the research is also pretty clear that human intuition is a real thing. It's not the fact that we're kidding ourselves that we have intuition. We do. It does get built up over time. It gets built up by experience and repetition. Some of us are more tuned than others for it. Human intuition is a real thing. The conclusion from a lot of the research, though, is that it's an incredibly weird, fragile, unreliable, biased thing as well. So we have these astonishing computers between our ears, but they've got a lot of glitches in them. And the glitches rise up and bite us over and over again. There's an entire field that studies this. It studies the glitches in our mental computers, and it was founded by a couple guys about a half century ago, one of whom has received a Nobel Prize for it, and it's called, the field is called biases and heuristics. What are these things that happen in our heads that keep us from being purely rational and making beautiful decisions? And there's this really interesting field where when you go listen to behavioral economists and behavioral psychologists, when you listen to their presentations, basically what they do is they identify yet another bias and then tease it out in experiments and show it to us, to the point that there are a lot of these biases that we have now. I tried to get a handle on how many there are. I tried to start a tally, and I got fatigued very quickly. Luckily, someone else actually did this work. If you really want to be kind of scared straight about your own intuition, this is a great book to read. It was originally published in Germany, and I think it was a runaway bestseller in Germany. It's now available in English, and it's called The Art of Thinking Clearly. What Rolf did here was try to catalog all the different glitches and biases and heuristics and things that make our mental computers not work perfectly, and just devote a short chapter to each of them. This book has 99 chapters in it. So you run through and you're like, yeah, okay, I do that. And you just start to realize how many faults there are in our wiring. So even though intuition is real and fantastic, there are things that really prevent us from tapping into it super deeply. So one thing is that our mental computers have a lot of glitches in them. The second thing is that when we can, it kind of looks like the things that we are good at are a subset of the things that data and algorithms and computers are good at. So let me try to make that concrete. People have looked at this in a fair amount of detail. There's some lovely work here, and we've tried to identify when we can actually build up intuition over time. What does intuition come from? Because it is a real thing. And we need three main conditions. You have to be in the right environment. And by that, I mean an environment that actually provides you information. You can't build up intuition as a doctor if a patient just walks in and says, "What's wrong with me?" and you don't get to examine them or look at their lab results or anything. You have to get information in. The environment has to be consistent, has to not change radically over time. And then finally, it has to be what people call tractable. In other words, it has to be a solvable problem. Anyone who tells you that he knows what the stock market is going to be at 2 years from now is lying to you and quite probably themselves, because that's not a tractable environment. It's essentially a random event. So we cannot make good predictions or build up good intuition about the long-term future of the stock market. We also, human beings, we need time to learn. You don't build up intuition overnight. It comes from a lot of time and a lot of repetitions. And then finally, this one is really important. You need quick feedback about whether you got it right or not. One of the reasons it's difficult to build up medical intuition is that very often you don't know if the patient got better or not for a long time. So that feedback loop is a really, really slow one. That tends to mess up our ability to build intuition over time and lets our biases rise up and bite us. So these are the conditions that we need to have in order to build up intuition over time. And again, we do build up intuition over time. This stuff is real. But they've also looked at the conditions that we need to build good algorithms, good computer models of a situation that will give us a prediction. And it turns out that they're almost exactly the same here as the conditions that you need for intuition. So let's just switch it a little bit. What do we need for good algorithms and good models? Well, we need environments that provide us with data that we can analyze. The environment has to be consistent. And again, no computer model is going to tell you exactly where the stock market's going to be 2 years from now. It's just not a tractable environment. The geeks need time to gather their data and refine and test their models. They need a lot of iterations too. And they need feedback. Did this work or not? You notice here that they don't need rapid feedback. You can do long-term studies about patient health and things like that and use those to build up your models. So one of the reasons that we're actually learning a lot about human nutrition and how to be healthier is that we have very long-term studies of human health, what people ate, what their health outcomes were. This helps us get out of the expert in the hippo school of nutrition and get into a much more data-driven science about how to eat and how to live well, simply because we have had time, we've had ample time to build our models and build up our digital expertise here. So that leads me to kind of a conclusion that I'm personally a little uncomfortable with, but if you have to go where the data take you, this is where the data are taking me. And I'm going to draw a cute little picture. I hope we all remember Venn diagrams from junior high school, because you're about to see one. So let's take the entire universe of situations where you might want to make a good prediction or a good decision. And there are tons of them out there. There are some of them that are going to be amenable to building good data-driven predictions, to taking this geek-driven Nate Silver approach to the world. I don't know how big that circle is compared to the overall universe here. I actually don't. Stock market prediction is not inside the circle. It's just a basically random event here. But there is some body of stuff that's amenable to developing good data-driven, good computer models of what's going on. If all of the preceding is right, the situations that are amenable to developing human expertise are actually a subset of that. In other words, we're like a minor league version of geeks and computers. I'm not totally comfortable with that, so let me move this Venn diagram just a little bit. I think this might be a more accurate way to say it, that there is some area where we're better than the computers, and that area has to do with either there is something unique about our computer, about our head, that we haven't yet been able to capture with algorithms and computer models, or our sensory abilities are so refined and so much better that we haven't yet figured out how to digitize our sense of smell or our sense of touch or whatever, so we need people for that. We have to be a little bit careful there, though, because Robert Parker would say, my palate is what lets me determine the quality of wine. We know that he's not as good as an algorithm with 3 inputs to it. So I'm not sure how much these circles overlap and how big they are in comparison, but the data, the research is mounting up. We are way too fond of our intuition and our expertise, and we rely way, way, way too much on hippos. The data are overwhelming that they are inferior time after time to a lot of what we should do and how we should be data-driven. Which brings up, I think, a couple fairly important questions, which I want to spend a little bit of time on, and then let's throw this open for discussion. First of all, this implies what the role for experts should be in a data-rich world. We're absolutely heading into a world of big data. That phrase is not just hype, it's reality. I'm going to be participating in a panel about big data later today. If you're interested in the phenomenon, please come and join us. So in a world where there's so much data out there, what is the proper role for experts? And I think there are 2 of them. The first one is to ask the right question. What are we trying to make a decision about? What are we trying to make a prediction about? Picasso in 1965 took a look at the new calculating machines, and he said, these things are useless. They can only give you answers. It's a fantastic quote. He's exactly half right. They're not useless. These are incredibly important machines. They're great additions, but they give answers. They're not question-asking machines. One of the things we still really need experts to do, I think, is help us figure out what we need to be smart at, what we need to have a good decision about. Once we do that, then the role becomes really uncomfortable for experts, and it's an inversion of the classic role for an expert. Because what we need experts to do is contribute their opinion, but to do it in a very particular way, to contribute their opinion to an algorithm. In other words, to be one more input to that geek machinery. This is not how most experts are used to thinking about their jobs. The way they think about their jobs is something like this. In other words, they say, fine, give me the results of the analysis, let the geeks do their work, present me what they come up with, and I'm going to use that as one input to my expert decision making. I'm going to use that as one input to my hippo process here. What we've learned is that doesn't work very well. They ignore the geeks far, far too often. A better approach, and one that's actually really powerful, is to flip this around so that you can ask an expert for their opinion. In other words, if you do an interview with somebody, do it in a fairly structured way, try to assess 3 or 4 different characteristics about that person, rank it on a 1 to 5 scale, do that a few different times, and we'll use those rankings as an input to our decision about whether or not to hire that person. So it's a complete inversion of the old way. We do want to involve people, we do want to involve experts, but they are one more input into the work of the geeks, into the algorithmic, data-driven work of the geeks. The experts, in other words, are just one more data source here. And time again, we see that if we can adopt this, this is actually a really powerful approach. Then we harness the power of experts and get rid of the faults in their mental computers. So I want to leave with 2 final thoughts. The first one is when do we still need hippos? And if we are heading into this data-rich world, what are hippos still good for? There are situations where data are still really scarce. You just don't have very much. The ground rule I'm walking around with these days is once you've got data, stop listening to the hippos. Until you get to that point, you probably still need to rely on them. There are some cases where we haven't yet been able to digitize, to quantify the environment, and our mental computers are still processing pretty effectively. So use that. And then finally, when we haven't been here before, I don't think we have an alternative except to rely on people who have been maybe somewhere close to this before and can do a translation or do some pattern matching. This is why I think, for example, really good venture capitalists still have a huge amount of value to add because they keep on evaluating very new situations, new technologies, new industries. Is this thing going to be big or not? Even with my geek hat on, I can't quite figure out how to bake that into an algorithm and disrupt the entire venture capital industry. I have talked to a lot of venture capitalists, though, who are trying to adopt that proper approach where their feelings are one more input to a data-driven decision about whether or not to invest in a company. So they're trying to find the proper role for their expertise in a data-rich world. And then finally, to the topic, the title of this talk, what on earth do we still need people at the top of organizations at all here, or leaders at all here? And I think there's a very sharp difference between an expert or a hippo and a leader. I think a leader is somebody who does these kinds of things, who sets a vision for where she wants the organization to go, who has the ability to build and motivate a team, both internally and externally, to execute on that vision, to be able to spot a new opportunity, to see something new. Still, we have computers that can answer questions. We don't have computers that can pose them very well, that can spot opportunities. And then finally, all this work of creativity and innovation and things that we talk so much about at the Ideas Festival every year, I have not seen that automated or digitized or baked into an algorithm. So the art of coming up with something new is still very human work and is still an appropriate role for a leader. I went yesterday to the session where Walter Isaacson interviewed Perry Chen, who's one of the founders of Kickstarter. And it was a brilliant session for a lot of reasons, mainly because I heard Perry articulating all these things over and over again extremely well, just being clear and consistent about what the organization was there for, talking about where the idea came from, how he got the idea to do something like Kickstarter, and then how he motivates both the community that they've built and the team of people that actually work at the company to execute and to keep growing that organization. So I want to be clear. I don't think that leaders are passé at all. I don't think that innovators are passé at all. But we need more clarity on what we human beings are actually good at versus where we should be handing the reins over to something else. And the more experience I get in this data-rich, kind of geek-heavy world, the more I come to the conclusion that hippos honestly should become an endangered species. Let me stop there. I'd love to hear any questions, comments, reaction to all of this. Yeah, please.
It sounds to me like housed in the land of infinite data is a necessary gift. It's really artful, which is to be discerning. So when you say Nate Silver had this signal that he spotted out of the noise, which is a really beautiful thing.
Yeah.
He had to do that with some intuitive leap.
Yeah.
So there we are back to this intangible asset.
So I can argue both sides of that question, kind of like every other question. I can argue both. So yes, you have to know what data to start mining and looking at to know where the signal is going to lie. You have to know where in the haystack to look for the needle is one argument, which is the argument I hear you making. A lot of the geeks that I talk to now say, nah. In other words, we have such astonishingly powerful computers and so much data out there that the right approach is to even get out of the hypothesis business, what might the relevant data be, and just start throwing tons of data at our models and seeing what emerges from it, seeing which of the data seem to have some value and which of it are completely useless. Now, I come down more on the former than the latter there. I'm with you. I still think some level of I know where to go look for the answer to this question is still valuable, but I talk to a lot of incredibly smart geeks who say, nah, just throw everything in the kitchen sink into some computer model, let the machine tell you where the signal is. That's also not a proper role for a human anymore in this world that we're creating. I haven't quite wrapped my mind around that, but I'm not saying they're wrong. It's, maybe we just need more time to get used to that. But I'm still primarily with you. One of the great geek skills is not only knowing how to play with the data, but knowing which data to start playing with. In Nate's case, he relied on a pretty standard body of data, these polls that we conduct day by day, state by state, all throughout the election season. His intuition and his work showed him that there actually is signal there. What he was so good at is realizing how to take the bias and take the noise out of that signal. So I'm making all this up. If the Gallup poll on average is biased 1.5% toward Democrats, fine, we've got geek tools that will let us correct and get that and dial it back 1.5%. So he and his colleagues have these great tools. Once you know about biases in data, it's very easy to correct. I think easier than it is to correct the biases that we have in our head, which are really hard to overcome. Yeah.
Can you wait for the microphone?
Yes, I'm sorry. Can we please wait a second for the mic?
So what's your take on Blink by Malcolm Gladwell?
It's a terrible book. So Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, is all about how basically you should trust your intuition. And in a lot of domains, the initial reaction that you make to something after you've built up experience in it is a good guide. Again, human intuition is a real thing. I believe in it. I find him really accurate about how you build it up over time and repetition. That doesn't mean you should rely on it. And he talks a lot about very good clinical psychologists. The data are incredibly clear. If you line up the diagnosis that they make about what's going on with the person versus something you'd get from a very stripped down questionnaire or a geek-based approach, no comparison at all. So the title for my next book, if I'm in a bad mood, the title for my next book is Don't Blink. Can we come here?
So you're the hippo in the room, so I'm hesitant to ask a question. How long is it going to take for our culture to adapt to this, right? Because if you consider the political example, we've got our news structures built around arguing experts.
Yeah.
The next election cycle will have Michael Barone arguing with Peggy Noonan or whomever, right?
Yeah. Does anyone here think that in 2016, we're not going to have talking head pundits on the cable news stations 24 hours a day? I find it hard to believe they're going to go, well, Nate Silver says 70% of a Hillary Clinton win. Let's roll up the cameras and go home. It's just not going to happen. So I love this question about how long is it going to take. The first indications about how bad the hippos were compared to the algorithms came about half a century ago, and they actually came from a trained Freudian psychologist of all things, which is the most data-free discipline that you'll ever come across. There's a guy named Paul Meehl, who was a very classically trained Freudian psychologist who also had this data bias, and he did the initial studies looking at diagnosis of a clinical expert versus, he called it an actuarial prediction, a data-driven prediction. And in about 1960, he wrote his first book saying, hey guys, our discipline has a problem here. Half century later, we still have plenty of hippos in the mental health and in medicine. So change comes slowly. In the world that I know best, which is the business world, nothing focuses the mind like a hanging. So I think if data-driven approaches really do let you do better talent management, HR, and prediction and whatnot, competition is going to drive out the inefficient companies and the hippos over time. When I go talk to a lot of the geekiest companies that I know, I see them working pretty hard to get the hippos out of the room. They find it difficult too, but like the head of HR at Google says, that they're trying very hard to be precise about when to use data and when to actually rely on people. Google, by the way, they did this huge study and they came to the conclusion that managers still matter. Because they're such a geeky, techie company, they could think, well, we can run this thing algorithmically. It turns out you can't. And amazingly enough, the things that a good manager needs, this was news to Google, it's probably not news to a lot of us, are things like people skills and consistency and oh, this is fantastic, we can run with this. So the change is coming. It's coming quicker in some disciplines than others, but we're going to have plenty of talking head hippos in 2016. We just know that. Don't listen to them is the conclusion. There's still no shortage of people telling you that they can manage your money better than the market. No, maybe if Warren Buffett said that to me, I'd believe him, but the number of people who think that they're market geniuses is so much higher than the number of market geniuses. The data are just incredibly clear on that. Can we go there?
Given your comments, and I'd be interested in yours also on this, so what do you do? You're in this scenario, you're running Romney's campaign, or you've got a 20-year-old who fits the 90th percentile thing, and how do you move the ball forward or get them out of that?
It's a great question. I know a little bit about the backstory of the two campaigns. So this is a tiny bit of inside baseball, but there's been a lot of great stuff written about the different approaches of the two campaigns, so we can all go educate ourselves. What basically happened on the Democratic side is that they got very badly surprised in 2010, I believe, when there was a special election in Massachusetts and Scott Brown got elected to the US Senate. This was, Ted Kennedy's old seat in blue state Massachusetts, and the polls, the data actually showed that Brown was surging, was probably ahead of Martha Coakley. Do I have the year right? This was 2010, right? Yeah, and the DNC ignored it. They took a hippo approach and said, okay, the polls are saying that, but I know what's really happening on the ground in Massachusetts. There's no way Ted Kennedy's seat is going to go to a Republican here. And there were a few geeks inside the Democratic apparatus who were trying to send up flares and say, guys, we have trouble here. After 2010, and they really just got badly beaten and surprised, the leadership on the Democratic side said, time out, something is really not right here. We've got to do two things. We've got to, first of all, centralize our data. And if any of us know about big organizations, centralizing data is an incredibly difficult thing to do at a technical level, but also the people who own these different data repositories don't want to give them up. They don't want to cede control or ownership of them. So centralizing the data was a really big deal. And you had to say to this field organization and this state party and all of that, we're going to put them all in the same big bucket. The second thing they did was set up an organization structure that was actually geek-driven. And they set up a really interesting a ground game where they would conduct experiments. They would do A/B testing on the email blast that they would send out, and they listened to them. I heard they spent on the order of 6 figures every day on internal polling that would guide their efforts. It was very expensive. It was a leap of faith that they had to believe the geeks that this was actually money well spent. And then they had to deploy resources according to what these these guys were kids. Like if you know the leaders of the Obama analytic campaign, they looked like they just stepped out of Silicon Valley, because they did. They were children, they had ear piercings, their hair was dyed weird colors. These are not who you typically listen to in a presidential campaign. So the organizational change they made on the Democratic side was really a wrenching, kind of a difficult one, but they did try hard to be more geek-driven as opposed to hippo-driven. And they had first-rate technologists setting up their actual infrastructure to crank this stuff out, to do the work, and then act on the results. And I haven't got nearly as much inside information on the Republican side. My impression is that they were still kind of a classic hippo-led campaign where the data were one input to the decisions made by a bunch of allegedly smart, experienced people sitting around a big conference table. Their technical infrastructure also was more fragile, so it let them down on election day, but that's the basic story that I've heard. What's really interesting to watch in that case is after they just got beat, and badly surprised in 2012, can they make those really difficult organizational changes to be geek-led during the next election cycles? I have no idea the answer to that. I do know it's really hard for big organizations to do. One of the things that impressed me most on the Democratic side was that they actually got out of the way, stopped listening to an old class of people, and started listening to a very different class of people.
I guess part of the question was, say, at organizational level, but also at personal level.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, on a personal level, if you look at, some statistic and it says, well, 98% of, 39-year-old MIT professors, da-da-da-da.
You flatter me, sir.
How do you get out of that?
Yep.
Or the 20-year-olds that you're going to talk about?
Yeah. Then I think the huge tendency that we have is to overemphasize the 2% that's not. And we believe on long shots way, way too much. We believe that we're exceptions to rules way, way, way too often. And the hard skill, I think at a personal level, is to look at that 98% and go, all right, then I'm gonna double down and place 49 out of my $50 over there as opposed to over there. Meg, does that sound right? I'm sorry, I have to give a plug for one of my fellow presenters here. Meg was at TED, gave one of the best TED Talks of 2013 about the lives and minds of 20-somethings. If you have a 20-something in your life, go listen to her on Monday at lunch.
Well, it's great to hear this.
And a very well-trained psychologist, right?
Thank you, and a data-driven psychologist.
Tell everyone your name, please.
Yes, I'm Meg Jay, and
J-A-Y.
It's great to listen to because I was actually a big fan of Paul Meehl, who the clinical psychologist he was referencing when I was in graduate school, and a lot of my work with 20-somethings is exactly what Andrew's talking about. It's not hippo versus geek, it's myth versus data.
Yeah.
And that 20-somethings are really being misled by a lot of myths, such as your 20s don't matter anymore, 30 is the new 20, you're only young once, you've got to do everything great in the first 10 years because the rest of your life's really going to stink. And that, that we need to talk about the actual data about how much your 20s do matter developmentally, to your personality, your brain, your career, your love life. It's an incredibly important time. The data shows it, but they're being misled by the myths, not the hippos in this case. But so I agree completely.
And Meg brings up a really fundamental point here. One of the I think the biggest glitches that we have with our mental computers is that we are incredibly persuaded by narrative and myth and a compelling story. I mean, and we have to guard against that all the time because this is how Don Draper makes us buy products. It's not because we need them or anything. That narrative is incredibly powerful. It's mentally very difficult to stop that and to go where the data tell you. It takes constant practice, I think.
I was just at a meeting.
Could we surrender the mic to somebody else? We can talk afterward. Sorry.
We have 5 minutes.
We have 5 minutes. In the back, please.
So I really appreciate what you're talking about on the data side, but how do you turn hippos into the new hippos? So as we go forward into education, I believe there's a lot of value in a new type of hippo where we can really actually teach them about how to use the data. So on the engineering, the big geek side, which, geeks, I work with them every day. They're not always as good about interpreting.
Amen.
You need somebody like you that can actually take that data. How do we merge those two schools in the future?
I don't know. It's long, slow, difficult work because we're fighting against our mental wiring, we're fighting against history, we're fighting against it's threatening to hippos to hear this kind of stuff. So it's very long, slow work. The things that I found that are at all persuasive are kind of a triangulation of research, of showing previous work, of statistics and data itself, and then narrative. So in other words, use people's faulty mental computing against them, do a little jujitsu, and tell a story about a wine snob versus a geek, and use that to illustrate the point. I have some faith that if we can continue to be persuasive on all three legs of that tripod, data, research, and compelling stories, we'll start to shift mindsets over time. But we can't pretend that it's fast work. Can we come up front?
The question is there research done that says that today's business leaders or hippos, as I'm assuming that's what you're referring to them,
Yeah.
are not using statistics to help make them make good decisions in what they're doing? And why wouldn't they be?
Yeah. So the research in the business world is lagging behind research in some other areas. Medicine has done a pretty good job of comparing geeks to hippos. There are fewer studies in the business world. What I've seen so far convinces me that we're no exception in the business world, that we're still way too fond of hippos, and that the main failure mode is for the hippo to take the data, to take the work of the geeks and say, all right, I believe that, but not that. That doesn't correspond to my intuition, so I'm going to ignore that part of the data story and follow my intuition. So the hard thing for hippos in business and every place else to do is to honestly surrender your intuition when the data are telling you something different. It's just really uncomfortable to do and really important to do. Yep, please.
Assuming we've spotted an opportunity here to invest more in data analytics or, let's say, creativity and allocate resources in our organization, what, if you were saying two things a leader of an organization could do to change the organization from the inertia of hippos and the way we've always done things to this kind of path, what are those two things you would tell somebody?
I would say, first of all, the data centralization effort is really important and really difficult. The more and the higher quality data that you give to your geeks, the better your decisions will be. The second thing, and the more important thing, is in a lot of big organizations that I've worked with and that I've studied, they have an analytics department. They've made an effort to hire some geeks and spend some money on technology, and then they tuck it way down low in the organization and way off to the side. So it's almost in some kind of skunk works off there, which is a great signal to the organization that these weirdos don't matter very much. What I've seen leaders of what I would call more enlightened organizations do is put the geeks higher and more central in the organization and make sure there's at least one of them at the table when the biggest decisions in the organization are being discussed. If you want to listen to my favorite leader outside the tech industry talk about how to do this, Gary Loveman is the CEO of Harrah's. And there's tons of video. He's written a bunch about this. He's fantastic. I don't say that just because he was educated at MIT and Harvard like I was, and then he went off to run a great big huge organization. He has tried super hard. He's been there, I think, for a decade, and he has tried super hard to take this company in a not very data-driven industry. You think about gambling, and it's all a bunch of pit bosses and people comping you drinks and stuff like that. What Gary did is figure out who he should be comping and who he shouldn't. And he's super articulate. My favorite quote from him is that when he gives speeches to the employees of Harrah's, he says, time and time again, he says, there are three ways to get fired at this organization. You can harass a colleague, you can steal, or you can fail to have a control group in an experiment. And after he says that to him, his organization understands what he means and goes and behaves accordingly. So he's my favorite example of a long, slow slog to transform a really traditional organization into a geek-led, data-driven one. I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you all for coming so early. I appreciate it.